Hey everyone, Tin Man here. A big part of my time playing World of Warcraft is doing dungeons and raids, which revolve around boss fights. Some fights are really fun, engaging, and well designed, while other boss fights just aren't. Why is this? Why are some really enjoyable to play and well liked, while others are just kind of boring loot pinatas, or even worse, frustrating, rage inducing annoyances? Let's explore the pillars of good boss design in World of Warcraft, specifically as it relates to the mechanics of the boss fight, not so much the difficulty or tuning or aesthetics of the encounter. The first hallmark of a good fight is a central unifying theme to the mechanics of the encounter. This could be anything that really makes you say, oh, that boss is the blank boss. For example, Artificer Zymox in Castle Nathria is the portal boss. If you just say the portal boss, everyone knows what you're talking about, and anytime you think of Artificer, you immediately think of portals. When someone is first experiencing a boss fight or first reading about it or watching a video about it, it's both easier to understand and more interesting to the player when you can kind of start the explanation by saying this boss does a special or unique thing, like Zymox lets you place portals that instantly transport you around the room. Then you can naturally think, oh, that's an interesting idea. What are the rest of the mechanics and how do they interact with that theme? In Artificer's case, you can then go and list the other mechanics like the tank and seed explosions, the spirits that you need to kite, and the big pull ability, and those all make sense in the context of portals. You can see that you need to use the portals to run away from the spirits or to get out of that big pull, and then coordinate the timings and positionings for them to drop off the explosions far away from everyone else. Even the traps that spawn near the players on Heroic and above are relevant to this, since you need to make sure that you have the space to safely access the portals at the right time. Those mechanics on their own would really be nothing special. We've seen plenty of times where there are ads that fixate, or explosions out range, or traps on the ground, but they're made much more interesting and engaging in the context of portals on Artificer Zymox. Compare this to, say, a fight like Stone Legion Generals, which is kind of just a list of abilities for the bosses and ads to have. There's really not a lot of interaction between the mechanics other than clearing the bleed debuffs. And you could really just easily remove just about any mechanic from that fight, and the fight would still make sense. It would still feel like the same fight. If you remove the portals from Artificer, though, nothing about the other mechanics is really interesting or even possible, and it's definitely not going to feel like the same fight. Another slightly less obvious example of a fight with a good theme is Domina Venomblade from Plaguefall. I'm going to try to keep most of my examples from the current Shadowlands content just so it's relevant and relatable to most current viewers. In this fight, there's a constant aura that gives you a requirement to stay next to an ally at all times. If you're too far away from an ally for too long, then you're going to be stunned and encased in a web wrap type thing. That's fine on its own, just stay stacked all the time, right? It seems pretty simple. Well, the other mechanics of a fight encourage you to be spread out. There's a targeting circle that will stun everybody caught inside of it, so you need to move out of the group with that. And then several ads will spawn very spread out in stealth all around the room, and players need to go to each one of them to break them out of stealth without spreading themselves too far apart and getting encased in that web wrap. For both of these mechanics, it would be so much better if the players were just always spread out around the room. Each of them on their own, these mechanics are not that hard. But because there's the central unifying theme of stay stacked up, then suddenly they become much more interesting to deal with and require a bit more thought and coordination. By having the central theme, other mechanics of the fight can be designed to interact with it, and those mechanics will feel like they make a lot more sense in the context of the fight, and it's also just much easier to design mechanics that fulfill the second pillar of good boss design, tension between mechanics. Most mechanics will require you to adjust your gameplay in some way. You either have to swap targets, interrupt a certain cast, move towards or away from something, maybe stack up or spread out, or some other change to just standing still and doing your normal rotation. I think that boss design is at its best when there are mechanics that encourage you to play in opposite ways. If every mechanic of the boss can be handled by doing the exact same thing, then the fight can start to become stagnant and boring, and you never really need to swap out of the play style that you're currently doing. I think a great example of this is Amarth, the second boss of Necrotic Wake. In this fight, the boss will frequently cast Deathbolt, which deals large damage to everybody in the group. But this is interruptible, though, so you're definitely encouraged to interrupt it as often as possible to help out your healer, but he does cast it a lot, so you're not always going to be able to interrupt every single cast depending on your interrupt cooldown. Additionally, the boss will occasionally spawn some adds that'll be spread out around the room. Typically, you'll want to group up these adds if possible to maximize cleave damage, and while the warrior adds are pretty easily taunted into melee range, there are 2 mage adds that spawn on the opposite sides of the room, and they're going to stay at range unless they're interrupted. This makes grouping them up a bit more of a challenge. If there was only one mage, then it would be very easy to just have the tank move the boss and the mobs to that mage, but since there are 2 of them, moving close to one means moving you further from the other. They also have a really important Frostbolt volley cast that will deal a lot of raid damage to the whole group. Now, all of these problems with the mages have a really simple solution though. Just interrupt their cast, and then they'll walk towards the tank. Sounds nice and easy, right? Well, remember, the boss also has a cast that you probably want to be interrupting as much as possible too. So now you have the tension between the 2 mechanics. On one hand, you want to interrupt the boss as much as possible, but then on the other hand, you need to make sure that you have your interrupt off cooldown to be able to interrupt the mages when they spawn. Also, you can mostly just target the boss for DPS for most of the fight and then just maybe cleave down the warrior adds, but the mages are very important to deal with quickly so they don't get too many more casts off. This means that the correct way to deal with the adds is not solely focus adds, and it's not solely focus boss and then cleave adds passively either. It's more of a mix of focus the mages and then swap to focusing the boss while you're cleaving the remainder of the adds. You do have to be careful though when talking about boss design that the fight does not have too much tension in it. If the mechanics are too opposed to each other or too punishing, if you prioritize one over the other, then it just becomes frustrating to play as you have to choose the least bad strategy rather than choosing an actively good one. Typically, the pattern that this is going to take will be something where you have a sort of baseline default strategy or playstyle, like in the case of Amarth, is interrupt Deathbolt on the boss. That's kind of your baseline assumption. But a specific mechanic will force you to change it up for a short period of time, like dealing with the adds, before reverting back to your default state. There needs to be a balance of both, kind of the default and the exception, because if you just always had adds up to deal with, it would not nearly be as interesting or engaging as alternating between the 2 states of sometimes adds, sometimes no adds. Typically, that time when you're doing something different is often the more dangerous or mechanically intensive part of the fight, and it's the most likely place for deaths or wipes to happen. And it's during this time that my 3rd design pillar comes in: opportunities for skillful play. People love flashy plays, highlight reels, or other opportunities to showcase their skill because it lets them feel important and useful, and they get to feel that their skill is what is winning the game, or in this case, beating the encounter or the dungeon, for their team. In World of Warcraft, there aren't quite as many opportunities for really flashy highlight reel style plays compared to other games, but there are definitely places where individual players can still be extremely useful to their team. This often comes from using your class utility properly, doing something above and beyond your basic DPS rotation to intelligently handle some mechanic more efficiently than another player or another class could. Some mechanics are made much easier with high mobility, for instance, like grabbing these orbs on Devos in Spires of Ascension. In these cases, classes like mages with Blink and Ultra Time, or like warlocks with Gateway and Demonic Circle, could do the mechanic and be back very quickly. While the mechanic is definitely possible for, say, slower melee characters to deal with, they incur a lot more downtime, it takes longer, and they also have less margin for error compared to classes with more mobility options. For some mechanics that apply debuffs, classes like Death Knights and Rogues can use Anti-Magic Shell or Cloak of Shadows to prevent them from getting the debuff. While most of these mechanics are absolutely manageable without these kinds of abilities, they certainly make things easier, and they give opportunities for individual players to be useful above and beyond the damage or healing that they bring. Other things that fall into this category are things like using movement abilities to counter knockback effects. I particularly like it when hunters use disengage to avoid being knocked off platforms. Also just simpler things like dispels, purges, or soothe effects that can be utility abilities that are not strictly required to beat an enemy, but it certainly gives more opportunities for players to interact with the mechanics in a class-specific way. Players should look at mechanics and think, how can my class handle this? Or for more organized groups, they may be thinking about all of the players and be thinking, who in our group has the best tools to handle this? And if we don't have somebody who can handle it very well, what is the best way to work around it? This keeps players more interested, more engaged with the mechanics that give, as opposed to mechanics that give no opportunities for smart plays or are just simple damage and healing checks. A lot of these mechanics revolve around mobility and positioning, which in turn makes you think a lot about the space that you have to work with. And that leads to my final pillar. Good boss design utilizes the encounter space in a meaningful way. There's a whole level of potentially interesting design available when you consider the space that a fight takes place in. I think far too many bosses have rather boring room layouts, which mostly boil down to a generic, large, circular-ish room. But it's not just about the size and the shape of the room alone, but how that interacts with the abilities and the mechanics of the encounter. For example, Executioner Tarvold, the second boss in Sanguine Depths, uses space amazingly well to create an interesting fight. Of course, this boss is kind of overtuned at the moment and is very difficult, especially on tyrannical weeks, but I want to focus on the design, not so much the damage tuning here. The fight takes place in a long, narrow corridor that doesn't give you a lot of room to move to your left and right. The boss then has three main mechanics that will interact with this geometry. First, there are tornadoes that move up and down the corridors on the left and right at predictable intervals. If you're standing close to where the boss spawns, then the tornadoes hit both sides of the room at the same time, leaving you nowhere to run. So naturally you're going to want to pull him away from that point to have some time to dodge each one. The dodging pattern is complicated though by the Castigate debuff that is cast occasionally, which targets a random player and then deals damage to everybody nearby. This means that the players can't be stacked up or near that group, but everyone does need to be able to move in sync in order to dodge the tornadoes properly. And the third mechanic, the ad that spawns, will deal AoE damage until it's killed, and then will drop a large puddle on the ground that you can't stand in, forcing you to continue moving down the hallway in sync. Each of these mechanics, the tornadoes, the Castigate debuff, and the ad that drops a pool on the ground, are not terribly complicated or difficult mechanics to deal with on their own in a standard wide-open boss room. But trying to do all of these mechanics in a long, narrow hallway, that becomes much more of a challenge and is a far more interesting boss design. That's not to say that large, wide-open rooms are necessarily bad in and of themselves. Some raid fights in particular can use a large room to make positioning within the room very interesting. Perhaps some enemies maybe spawn on one end of the room, while other mechanics are happening on the other side. This could lead to interesting decisions about where to position to be in range for DPS or healing, as well as to make group movements or shifts an interesting strategy consideration. The two examples from Castle Nathria that come to mind that use a large wide open room very well are the aforementioned Artificer Zymox, whose mechanics have a very, very large range, but the portals are used to help traverse that large distance involved. In a small room or one with a significantly different shape, the mechanics just wouldn't be as impactful as they are with the current room geometry. The other example is Sun King's Salvation, specifically on Mythic, where the Phoenix ads do not despawn. This creates a sort of rising tension as the fight goes on, as you initially have plenty of space to move around and position, but the room does gradually fill up with fire from the Phoenix ads and the Shade, making it a race against time to finish the encounter before you run out of room. There are even opportunities for smart play here, since you can slow, knock back, or otherwise control the Phoenixes, and properly baiting the Shade's fire attacks to buy your team more time will make sure that you have access to the pedestals on the one side of the room to be able to complete the fight in time. So that does it for my 4 pillars of good boss design in World of Warcraft. Encounters should have a unifying theme, mechanics that are in tension with one another, opportunities for skillful individual play, and interesting utilization of the encounter space. Bosses that do all or most of these things will tend to be very engaging, interesting, fun to play, and rewarding for players to defeat. Boss designs that don't do these things will tend to feel either too dull or too overly chaotic, and possibly just very frustrating to learn and play against. There's a lot more to talk about in terms of boss design as well, particularly as it relates to end bosses of raids, which tend to be much longer and have many more mechanics, as well as a discussion on difficulty and tuning. So if you like this kind of design talk, please do let me know in the comments down below so I can make some videos exploring these other topics. Make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell, all that good YouTube stuff. Thank you all so very much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you next time.